Chapter 2, The Sacrifice. "That's good," Asao said, patting Hanyu's shoulder. Hanyu scoffed and dropped the flute into his lap, flashing a grin at his friend. "You don't have to lie." "Better, then," Asao amended, with a smile that quickly turned serious. "Now come on, don't stop. This is no time to get lazy." Hanyu bent his head and accepted his friend's reproof humbly, but he couldn't help reflecting that anyone would seem lazy to Asao. The other boy was first in most of their classes and second in the rest, and there was no one more eager to serve the gods when their chance arrived. It would be any day now. Hanyu glanced across the temple courtyard at the class of 18 and 19-year-olds who were doing their exercises by moonlight. They had already been switched to the god's nocturnal schedule, and soon they would be the oldest cadre of the temple, the ones the priest fussed over and pampered and scolded and checked for defects. It seemed like mere weeks ago that Hanyu's own cadre had ascended, when the older boys were claimed by Lord Claudia's court. In fact, it had been nearly 2 years, and Lord Antony's court would arrive within the week. There were 3 great lords among the gods, Claudia, Antony, and Titus. They lived in massive ships on the sea, locked in eternal battle with the terrible monsters that dwelt in the depths and waited for their chance to escape the gods' grip and devour the humans. Every other year, one of those 3 lords would journey with their court to bless the people of Taisha, drive back any neighboring kingdoms which had begun infringing on their lands, and claim the tribute of 30 flawless young men. Hanyu had known these facts since he was a child, toddling through the temple nursery, but even so, it was difficult to wrap his mind around the fact that any day now he would truly be claimed by the gods and enter their service. He didn't feel ready. He certainly didn't feel flawless, as the terms of the sacrifice demanded. He danced and sang adequately and did well enough in the classes pertaining to housekeeping, cooking, and intimate services like sex and massage, but his only true talent seemed to be for reading and recitation, and he was abysmal at playing music, as Asao had just witnessed. "Come on," Asao urged, his handsome face splitting into an encouraging grin. "Lord Antony's supposed to love the flute." Hanyu knew he wouldn't be getting anywhere near Lord Antony, but he hated to disappoint his friend. Even more, he would hate to disappoint the gods. He knew his chances of being selected for personal service were slim, but he would still belong to the court, and he ached to be pleasing in whatever capacity the gods chose to use him. Asao, though, was sure to be chosen by one of the foremost gods as a personal attendant. Everybody knew it, but Asao didn't preen or lord it over them. Here he was, helping Hanyu, even as their destiny bore down upon them. Hanyu lifted the flute back to his lips. The sounds that came from the abused instrument didn't sound any different to him, but Asao's face lit up and he even clapped his hands, bouncing a little in place. "That's great!" he cried. His next words were lost when a deep, resonant tone split the night. Hanyu froze, his heart thudding painfully against his chest as the temple bells continued to toll. He stared at Asao, and his friend stared back, his jaw slack and his face chalky. The bells rang on, heralding the arrival of the gods. 10 minutes later, Hanyu shoved through the door to the great hall with Asao on his heels. Most of their cadre was there already. The young men clustered in little groups and filled the air with anxious whispers, making the grand, high-ceilinged space sound like a lair of a great serpent. However, the presence of Father Shu kept anyone from speaking too loudly. He stood near the center of the room, his bright robe slightly rumpled, but his expression as calm and firm as ever. He was the priest in charge of overseeing the upbringing and education of the offerings, and his absolute authority had been a part of all their universes as long as they could remember. Hanyu, as usual, still couldn't keep quiet. "Is it them, Father?" he cried as he and Asao skittered towards the priest. "Softly, Hanyu," the older man chastised him. "And don't ask foolish questions. Of course it's them." Hanyu ducked his head. "Sorry, Father." When he looked up, however, the priest was smiling fondly at them. "You're good boys," he said. "The gods will be pleased. How are you feeling, Asao?" Esau bowed. I'm ready, Father. Good, good. The priest turned and clapped his hands loudly. Pale, nervous faces swung towards them, and the susurrating whispers died away. Take position, boys. Try to relax, and I'll see if everyone's here. Yes, good. Hanyu collapsed gratefully to his knees and flopped forward into the formal bow they'd practiced all their lives. He was aware of Esau beside him, sinking to the floor as gracefully as a dewdrop sliding down a flower petal. The position was familiar and comforting. Hanyu appreciated the way it cut off visual stimulation and stopped his nervous shifting and fidgeting, though his heart continued galloping madly in his chest. He pulled in a deep breath and forced himself to relax. Unfortunately, there was no way to relax his brain, which kept whirling unstoppably from one thought to another. We're still missing Morio. Ah, there you are, the priest said, smile clear in his voice as a final set of feet pounded into the room. Everyone take 10 deep breaths. Hanyu obeyed readily, but the exercise did little to calm the frantic thoughts spiraling through his mind. I'm going on the ship! I'm going to see the whole ocean! I'm going to see the monsters! I'll get to meet so many new people! Well, gods. What if the gods don't like me? What if I'm clumsy and stupid and talk out of turn and ruin everything? What if... Good, Father Shu's voice interrupted. Now, I know you're all nervous, but there's nothing to be afraid of. You're good, handsome, clever, obedient boys, and you know what to do. You have been chosen for a great honor, and you are well equipped to excel. It has been a true pleasure to teach you, but you have learned all you need from us. The gods will be giving you your orders now, and all you have to do is obey and show your gratitude for the opportunity you've been granted. It isn't anything you can't handle. Frankly, Hanyu wasn't so sure, but it was a nice sentiment. Now go to the baths, the priest instructed. The ceremony won't be held for 2 days, so there's plenty of time to get ready. Hanyu had always loved watching the sacred processions. When they were 8, he jumped up and down so excitedly that he'd fumbled his candle and set Esau's robe on fire. That stunt had cost him a month of desserts, but Esau had shared his, so it was bearable. Now, Hanyu couldn't resist slipping his hand into Esau's as they walked, no longer observers, but part of the parade. The offerings were near the front of the procession, right after the temple guards. It was comforting to know that the priests were at their back, especially Father Shu. Behind them came the king and his entourage, and after him were the gods. Hanyu's heart thudded with painful intensity, and he squeezed the slim, capable hand in his. Esau squeezed back. Hanyu wanted to turn his head and look at his friend, but the crowds gathered on either side of the road commanded his full attention. There they stood, where he had stood so many times before, holding their candles and cheering as the offerings walked past them. The noise felt so much more shattering this year than ever before. Had it always been this loud? The cool night air was heavy with smoke, incense, and the heady scent of moon lilies. Spectators wore the slender white flowers in garlands around their necks, held baskets full to brimming with them, and clutched them by armfuls or handfuls. Most were waiting to throw their flowers at the feet of the gods, but several spared a blossom or two for the passing offerings. A moon lily struck softly against Hanyu's arm. Instinctively, he caught it. Now what? He glanced over at Esau. His friend's snowy ceremonial robe seemed to glow in the darkness, and the candlelight sparkled in the jewels woven through his hair and the powders adorning the lids of his wide, dark eyes. He looked like a painting of a calm, smiling angel, too perfect to alter in any way, but Hanyu couldn't resist. He reached over and tucked the moon lily behind Esau's ear. His friend turned and met his eyes with a small smile, and even in the shifting candlelight, Hanyu could see his lips trembling, just a little. Esau might look beatific, but he was terrified. Hanyu was suddenly certain that his friend was far more frightened than Hanyu himself. Why? Of course the change was intimidating, and it was hardly cowardice to tremble a little when they were about to be presented to immortal gods. But didn't Esau feel any excitement? In 20 years, they'd barely left the temple grounds, and now they were about to step onto a ship and sail off into the wild sea. After training their whole lives, they were going to fulfill their purpose and go to places and see sights and learn mysteries that no other mortals could even dream of. It was a wonderful adventure, and as Lord Antony's personal attendant, Esau's fate would be the most wonderful of all. He would speak with the great god, dwell in his chambers, perhaps even be granted the honor of sharing his bed. Really, there was no reason for Esau to be the least bit afraid. Hanyu squared his shoulders, stood straighter, and gave his friend a wide grin and a firm squeeze of the hand. He'd be brave and excited for both of them then, and hope it rubbed off. He went back to grinning and waving at the crowd. Gods, there were so many of them! He knew he was supposed to maintain a calm, solemn demeanor, as befitted the gravity and sacredness of the occasion, but there were so many smiling faces it was impossible not to smile back. Anyhow, who would scold him now? The priests and offerings had said their goodbyes before the procession began. The king couldn't see him, and once they were claimed, they would answer only to the gods. Hanyu didn't have many acquaintances outside the temple, but he felt the crowd's affection like a tangible thing. On an impulse, he blew a kiss to a wide-eyed little girl perched on her father's shoulders, and the crowd redoubled their cheers, pelting him and Esau with a sudden blizzard of lilies. Encouraged, Hanyu went on blowing kisses and waving, swinging Esau's arm jauntily with his own. It was wonderful to be so admired, and he basked and preened until they neared the harbor and he caught sight of the great ship. So many things that had seemed enormous when he was a child had diminished as he'd aged. Trees and buildings alike had grown smaller and dimmer when viewed through his adult eyes. Lord Antony's vessel, however, seemed even more impressive now than it had the last time he'd seen it, 6 years ago. The ship towered over all the little fishing vessels in the harbor. Even with the sails rolled tightly, it blotted out an impossible number of stars. The temple guards escorted the offerings up a few steps to the huge ceremonial dais. After the little candles of the procession, the torches that blazed all around the railing of the platform stung Hanyu's eyes. The guards arranged the offerings in 2 rows of 15, and Hanyu had to let go of Esau's hand when a guard pulled his friend to the front of the first line. It was the spot that indicated his status as the most exceptional of the offerings, and Hanyu couldn't help swelling a little with pride at seeing his best friend so honored. Hanyu himself was placed near the middle of the back row. He stood between Gen and Daiji, 2 more of his friends. They were all his friends to some degree, this cadre of 30 boys with whom he'd shared every day of his life. They'd played together in the temple courtyards, traded bits of food in the dining hall, competed fiercely to be the most graceful and learned and skilled, and as they stood in their 2 perfect lines, Hanyu was overwhelmed with love and admiration for them all. They were so beautiful in their ceremonial robes, their hair perfectly arranged and makeup perfectly applied, their familiar faces rendered lovely and exotic in the firelight. Hanyu was so proud to be one of them. Suddenly, he couldn't wait for the gods to arrive and see what glorious tribute his city offered them tonight. He found himself tearing up and blinked hard to clear the stinging from his eyes. He'd always cried far too easily, at happiness and unhappiness alike. Tonight, the tears that threatened were tears of love and pride and nostalgia. They had all worked so hard to be ready for tonight, and surely even a god would be impressed. The priests arrived. Most of them remained on the ground level, but the high priest ascended the steps in his full regalia. Hanyu had never been this close to him before, and he couldn't help feeling a little shy. The man had a sharp, forbidding face, very different from Father Shu's, and his elaborate gold headdress reflected strangely onto its crags. He gave the boys a quick, evaluating look that made Hanyu's skin prickle with irritation. "When Lord Antony and his court ascend the dais, you will make your full bows," the high priest said, not bothering with any kind of greeting. "You will remain in position until Lord Antony is ready to make his selection. When I give the command, you will rise to your knees. First Lord Antony will choose, then Lord Marcus, then Lord Theodora. Do not meet the gods' eyes or make any movement to try and draw their gaze and persuade them to select you. Stillness and obedience will serve you better than any attempt at attention grabbing. You will remain silent throughout the ceremony. Your silence begins now." Once the priest's back was turned, Hanyu glanced over at Jen and rolled his eyes. The other boy's lips quirked up, but that was all. Strange. Jen laughed at everything. Why was everyone so serious? Of course it was a solemn occasion, but wasn't anybody else happy? Excited? The king's retinue stopped at the foot of the platform. Hanyu wished he knew more about the ruling class, at least enough that he could tell who was the queen or the crown prince, or at least the duke that was Father Shu's uncle. Unfortunately, he'd only ever seen them in these processions, and always at too great a distance to distinguish their faces. Most of the nobles and royals withdrew to chairs a few feet away from the ceremonial dais where Hanyu lost sight of them, but the king himself, at least Hanyu thought he must be the king, due to the enormous crown he wore, walked up the steps and stood next to the high priest. He kept his back to the offerings, so Hanyu felt free to peer curiously at him. Under his grand crown and elaborate robes, he was heavy-set and, when he turned his head to speak with the priest, tired-looking, and Hanyu thought he must be unaccustomed to the nocturnal schedule the gods in temple kept. Then Hanyu stopped thinking, because the crowd's cheers had grown louder than even the presence of the king could warrant. He looked quickly towards the road, but the other offerings were all thudding to their knees around him. He didn't have any more time to try to catch a glimpse. Hanyu sank down beside the others. The roar of the crowd seemed to die away. After an endless wait, Hanyu felt the wooden dais under his knees and forehead vibrate faintly with approaching steps. The crowd quieted, and the steps grew closer. It took every bit of self-control Hanyu possessed to keep from peeking. "Rise," said an unfamiliar voice. It was deep and resonant, and even the one word contained hints of a rich accent, the like of which Hanyu had never heard. He suppressed a shiver. There was some rustling as the king and high priest got to their feet, and the ritual began. "My dread lord," the priest said grandly, "your servants humbly beg that you accept this sacrifice of 30 flawless youths, handsome and sound of body, which we willingly offer in tribute to your might and greatness." "What would you have in exchange for this sacrifice?" That voice again. It had to be Lord Antony. Hanyu pressed his forehead harder onto the dais, struggling against the overwhelming desire to sneak a look. "Your generous protection, my lord, for which we are eternally grateful." That speaker wasn't the high priest. Had to be the king. He sounded as tired as he looked. "Our southern villages have been harried by Surgish raiders in recent months, and we humbly request that you reveal your power and show them the folly of harming the gods chosen." "It will be done," Lord Antony replied, his voice darkening a little in a way that made Hanyu's body stop itching to sit up and gawk. However, when he spoke again, the menace was gone. "I will now choose my personal attendant from among these offerings. Marcus and Theodora will choose as well, and then we will conduct the remaining sacrifices to our servants' quarters. All of these offerings are accepted into our service." Hanyu relaxed a little at those words. It was rare for an offering to be rejected, but it happened sometimes. Father Shu would be pleased that Lord Antony had accepted them all before examining them closely. It indicated that the god had faith in the temple's selection and training. Hanyu pushed himself up to his knees, struggling anew to keep his eyes respectfully lowered. He couldn't see Asao from this angle, but after a moment he knew enough time had passed that Lord Antony must have walked past his friend. Well, that was nothing to be worried about. Of course the great god would want to examine all of them, but he would return to Asao. Asao was obviously the best choice. Footsteps paced before their lines, and finally the voice spoke again. "That one," Lord Antony said casually. Had he not chosen Asao? It was unthinkable, but he was standing near the middle of the lines, closer to Hanyu. Hanyu tried to remember who had been in front of him. Taiki, perhaps? Tyche would be a good choice, but surely there was some mistake. It had to be Esau. Another voice spoke out a moment later, lower and rougher than Lord Antony's. Lord Marcus, it must have been. His "that one" came from the end of the line. Definitely Esau. Well, that was all right then. Lord Marcus was Lord Antony's war chief and second in command. Everybody knew that. It was less honor than Esau deserved, but not by much. Lord Theodora's choice followed, and then the gods were descending the steps with the king and priest, no doubt to iron out where exactly the raiders were located. A moment later, the temple guards dispersed among the offerings, helping them to their feet. A large hand filled Hanyu's field of vision, and when he took it and stood, he found that there were 3 guards clustered around him. "This way, sir," one said. "Sir?" As a cluster of offerings descended the steps and was herded toward the dock, Hanyu's 3 guards maneuvered him over to Esau. Hanyu was surprised, but grateful for the chance to say goodbye. Who knew how long it would be before the honored personal attendant of the war chief would have time to seek him out? Esau didn't seem to share his excitement. His face was pale and still, and he seemed to be avoiding Hanyu's gaze. "Congratulations, Esau," Hanyu whispered. His friend's face darkened even further. Was he really so disappointed? Hanyu rushed to cover his mistake. "I know it's not what we thought, but still, Lord Marcus himself. They say he drove off an entire legion of desert dwellers single-handedly when the gods were clearing out our city for us." Esau didn't look much cheered, so Hanyu plunged ahead. "Lord Antony must have promised him the finest of us in return for some great service, but once he sees how you serve his second, he'll know he made a terrible mistake. Hanyu!" Esau finally looked up, his eyes round with shock. "You mustn't say such things. That's blasphemy." Was it? If Esau said so, then probably. Esau was usually right about these things. "Lord Antony did not make a mistake," Esau continued, his face going a little red with anger. "How could you speak so disrespectfully of your master?" His master? Well, technically, yes, the way the king had been his master here in the city, too distantly to be offended by, or even aware of, the occasional slip of his tongue. Why was Esau getting so upset with him? When they reached the god's ship, the guards moved Hanyu, Esau, and a gentle, quiet boy named Kenta away from the rest. Wait, what? Hanyu puzzled through the events of the last few minutes as a dozen or so human attendants made their way down the gangplank. One temple guard, apparently the leader of the small group, bowed as the favored servants approached. "Honored ones," he said, "here are the personal attendants." Suddenly, Hanyu understood. He felt his jaw slacken as he jerked his head around to gawk at Esau. His friend, once more, was staring at his own feet and refusing to meet his eyes. The guard placed a hand on Hanyu's shoulder, pushing him gently forward as he said, "This one is Lord Antony's choice."